What's up everybody, hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our channel sponsors International MTG on TCG Player, as well as Martin from the Hobby Horse. We've also started a new Discord channel which is free to join, so come hang out with us. Link in the description of this video. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we're bringing you another fun game that we recorded a couple weeks ago down at the Hobby Horse. This week's game features Foil returning this week, trying to protect his winning record playing Ojer Pakpatiq Deepest Epic, Ryan back once again playing Aragorn Hornbug Hero, Fogral playing his newly built 0-power Rigo Streetwise Mentor deck, and Patrick back once again trying to spin the Naya wheel playing Mayael the Anima. Now that we've our fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Patrick plays an untapped fortified village, revealing a forest from his hand before paying 1 for Alonor Elves. Foil plays an island for turn while he passes to Ryan, who also plays a forest for turn. Fog plays an evolving wilds before cracking it, passing his turn, going to get a tapped forest to put into play. Patrick plays a Carplusian forest for turn before tapping out, losing a life in order to cast his commander Mayael. Foil plays another island and casts a Mind Stone. Ryan plays a branched off pathway for turn, tapping out in order to cast a Paradise Druid. Fog plays a plains for turn before paying 1 for a Market Gnome. Patrick draws, then plays a forest for turn before casting a Soul Ring. Patrick then taps out, once again losing a life in order to cast a Spellbreaker Behemoth. Foil plays an island for turn and then pays 2 for a Sapphire Medallion before paying an additional 1 for a Mercurial Spelldancer. Ryan draws and misses a land drop before casting a Birds of Paradise. Fog plays an untapped Rejuvenating Springs for turn before paying 1 for Sidisi's Faithful. Patrick draws and then taps out, losing another life in order to activate his commander's ability. He then looks at the top 5 cards of his library, which has him putting into play a Worldspine Worm, before going to combat, swinging his Behemoth over at Fog for 5 damage. He then draws on his instep, but Foil draws for turn and then pays in order to cast his commander Ojer Pakpatiq. Ryan once again misses a land drop and then pays 3 to cast Krinko 10th Street Kingpin. Fog plays an untapped Sea of Clouds before paying 1 for a Kraken Hatchling. He then taps out and casts his commander Rigo, who enters with a shield counter. Fog then goes to combat, swinging a creature over at Patrick and 1 over at Ryan, which has him drawing 2 cards while they both take 0 damage. Patrick plays a Temple of Abandon for turn, keeping the card on top of his library before he then once again activates his commander's ability. This then has him hitting a God Eternal Ronus before he decides to swing him over at Ryan while he swings his Behemoth back over at Fog. Before damage is dealt, Foil casts a Snap in order to return the worm back to Patrick's hand. This then has him untapping 2 of his lands while Fog decides to block with his commander, having him lose his shield counter. Foil then goes to his upkeep, rebounding the Snap, this time returning the Behemoth back to Patrick's hand. Foil then draws for turn and goes to combat, swinging the Spelldancer over at Patrick, who takes the damage and has Foil removing 2 counters off the Spelldancer. He then pays in order to cast a Chemister's Insight, getting 2 copies, which has him drawing 4 cards. Foil then plays his land for turn before passing. Ryan draws for turn before going to combat, swinging Krinko over at Fog. Fog then blocks with a Kraken Hatchling, but it still gives Ryan 2 Goblin tokens. He then casts a Nimpa Call and passes. Fog plays a forest for turn before it taps out in order to cast a Council of 4. He then also casts a free Ornithopter before going to combat. He then swings 1 creature apiece at both Foil and Patrick, which has him drawing 2 cards. Patrick draws for turn and then casts a Dawnglade Regent, which has him becoming the Monarch when it enters play. He then goes to his instep and draws, while Foil pays in order to cast an Impulse so he can look at the top 4 cards of his library. He then puts 1 into his hand and the rest on the bottom of his library before he then untaps and goes to his upkeep, rebounding both of his spells. He first rebounds Chemister's Insight in order to draw 2 cards, before he then rebounds the Impulse, looking at the top 4 cards of his library, once again putting 1 into his hand while he bottoms the rest. He then draws and plays a Reliquary Tower as his land for turn. Foil then pays in order to cast a Propaganda before going to combat, swinging his commander over Patrick for 4 commander damage. This then has Foil becoming the Monarch before he goes to his instep, drawing a card. Ryan draws for turn and somehow still has enough mana to tap out in order to cast his commander Aragorn. Ryan then goes to combat, swinging a Nimpa Call and Krinko over at Fog, and this once again has him creating more tokens. Fog then blocks both of the creatures and Ryan creates his tokens before passing. Fog plays an island as his land for turn before paying 3 for Glunch the Bestower, as well as 2 more for Dragon's Eye Savants. He then draws off the Council of 4 as well as creating a Knight token. Fog then goes to combat, swinging the Ornithopter over at Ryan while he swings his Market Gnome over at Patrick. This then has him drawing 2 cards while Patrick blocks with Mayael. Fog then goes to his instep, having Patrick draw a card while Foil puts 2 counters on his creature and he creates 2 treasure tokens. Patrick plays a Plains for turn before he then pays 7 to cast Thorn Mammoth, having it fight Ryan's Krinko when it enters play. Crinkle then gets sent to the graveyard, and on his instep, Foil casts Contact Other Plane. He then rolls a randomized d20, which has him scrying 2 cards before he then draws 2. Foil then rebounds the spell on his upkeep, which once again has him rolling a d20 and scrying 2 more cards before he then draws 2. He then draws for turn and plays a Castle Vantress. Foil then casts a Soul Ring of his own before going to combat, this time swinging the Spell Dancer over at Ryan for 2 damage. He then removes 2 counters off the Spell Dancer before casting his next spell, giving him 2 copies of High Tide. This then has him casting a Jin-Gitaxias Progress Tyrant as well as a Jace's Sanctum. This then has him going to his instep, drawing a card, while Ryan draws for turn. He then pays 4 and casts Jetmir Nexus of Revels before going to combat. Ryan then for some reason decides to swing all out with his creatures over at Fog, who blocks accordingly. But before damage is dealt, Foil casts a March of Swirling Mist, exiling 2 of Ryan's creatures, which has Fog only taking 4 damage. Fog draws for turn and then plays a Command Tower. He then pays to cast Gretchen Titchwillow as well as a Tide Drifter. He finally casts Watley the Sun's Heart before deciding to go to combat. This then has Fog swinging 2 of his creatures over at Ryan, who can't block and ends up taking 8 damage while he draws a card. He then lets Patrick draw a card while Ryan puts 2 counters on his creatures and he creates 2 more treasures. Patrick plays a Force for turn before recasting his Spellbreaker Behemoth. He then has it fight the Anim Bakal when it enters play, sending Anim to the graveyard. He then makes a deal with Fog, which has him casting a Swords to Plowshares, which gets countered by Jin-Gitaxias before Fog can cast a Return to Nature. This then has Fog blowing up the Propaganda in order to allow Patrick to attack Foil with his Dawnglade Regent so he can become the Monarch again. Patrick then draws on his instep, and on his upkeep, Foil spells rebound. Foil then casts the High Tide before he then also casts the March of Swirling Mist where X is equal to 0, sending it to the graveyard. He then draws and plays an island as his land for turn. He then casts Baral, Chief of Compliance, as well as an Archaeomancer, which has him returning the March of Swirling Mist back to his hand from his graveyard. Foil then casts a Solemn Simulacrum, which has him going into his library in order to get an island to put into play tapped, before he then decides to go to combat. This then has him swinging his Spell Dancer over at Fog this time for 2 damage, which has him removing 2 of its counters. This then has him casting and getting 2 copies of Archmage's Charm, which has him choosing to draw 2 cards 2 times. He then also pays to cast a Chrome Host Seed Shark, as well as an As Foretold and a Mocking Sprite. Ryan draws for turn and still doesn't hit a land, but at least both of his creatures phase back in. He then decides to pay 4 and cast Marissi, Breaker of the Coil. Ryan then decides to go to combat, swinging creatures out of both Patrick and Foil. Patrick and Foil both choose to block accordingly, which has Ryan still becoming the Monarch, while Patrick goes down to 6 life and Foil goes down to 17. Ryan's creatures that dealt damage all become renowned, and he goes to his instep, drawing a card. Fog plays another island for turn before paying 4 to cast Dusk. In response to this, Patrick casts Semester's End in order to exile all the creatures he controls until the beginning of the next instep. All the creatures power 3 or greater then get wiped off the board before Fog pays in order to cast an Armored World Turtle. He then also casts a Tasseled Dromedary before deciding to go to combat. He then swings 1 creature apiece at both Foil and Patrick, while he swings the rest of the available creatures over at Ryan. This then has him drawing 3 cards while Ryan gets taken down to 10 life. On his instep, he has Foil draw a card while Patrick puts 2 counters on a creature he doesn't control, and he creates 2 treasure tokens, before he then draws on his instep from being the Monarch. Patrick's creatures then all come back into play, each with an additional 1/1 counter on him, which has him once again becoming the Monarch when the Dawnglade Regent enters. He then draws for turn before tapping out in order to cast Endray's Forerunners. He then swings the pumped up Elfin Forerunners over at Ryan, while he swings the Dawnglade Regent over at Watley. Watley then gets sent to the graveyard where Ryan gets taken out of the game. Patrick draws on his instep, and on his upkeep, Foil rebounds the Archmage's Charm, once again choosing to draw 2 cards. Foil then draws for turn and plays another island. He then remembers to create an Incubator token with 3 counters on it before he then casts Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. This then has him upticking Jace to mill himself before he draws a card. He then goes to combat, swinging 2 creatures over at Fog while he swings his 2 flyers over at Patrick. Fog then takes his damage while Patrick gets taken out of the game, and on his instep, Foil draws a card while Fog untaps for turn. Fog then plays a Planch for turn before flashing back Savine's Reclamation in order to return Watley from his graveyard back into play. He then casts an Embodiment of Spring as well as an Aegis Turtle. This then has him upticking Watley in order to gain 8 life before he goes to combat, swinging out a foil with all of his available creatures. In response, Foil casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift in order to bounce all the Fog's permanents. Foil then creates another Incubator token while Fog gathers all of his permanents back to his hand. Fog then recasts his Ornithopter for free before targeting it with a Fell of the Mighty. This then gets countered by Foil with an Arcane Denial, and Fog passes his turn to Foil, who on his end step pays to transform one of his Incubator tokens. Foil draws for turn and then plays an island. He then pays to transform his other Incubator token before going to combat, swinging out at Fog with all of his creatures. Fog then takes all the damage, going down to 20 life, after which Foil upticks Jace, once again milling himself before drawing a card. Fog draws for turn before paying to cast a Merfolk Secret Keeper as well as a Yoked Ox. He then also recasts his Aegis Turtle, Kraken Hatchling, and Glunch the Bestower, as well as his Dragon's Eye Savant, and on his end step, Foil pays to jumpstart his Chemister's Insight. This then has him creating another Incubator token before he then draws 2 cards. Foil then draws for turn and pays to cast a Jin-Gitaxias. He then upticks Jace in order to mill himself 2 cards before drawing. Foil then goes to combat, swinging out at Fog with all but 2 of his creatures, which has Fog blocking accordingly, but still going down to 16 life. Foil then casts a pair of Swiftfoot Boots, which he then pays in order to equip to his Brawl. He then pays in order to cast a Flow of Ideas, which has him drawing 8 cards, before he then pays 2 and casts an Ominous Seas. Finally, he casts a Sensei's Top before drawing on his end step from being the Monarch. Fog untaps for turn and then plays a tap Bountiful Promenade. He then tries to recast Watley, which then gets countered by Foil with a Cryptic Command, which also has Foil drawing a card. Fog then casts an Assault Formation before casting a Sidici's Faithful, exploiting one of his creatures in order to bounce a Chromehead Seed Shark back to Foil's hand. Fog then decides Methods for blockers and decides to swing out with all of his creatures over at Foil, who in response casts March of Swirling Mist, once again phasing out all of his creatures. After this, Fog knows he's dead to the crackback swing, so he scoops the game up to Foil. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe in order to see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.